Marcus Reed didn't believe in equals. That wasn't arrogance, it was simply the architecture of his world, built brick by brick over 30 years of calculated decisions, ruthless strategy, and an absolute refusal to confuse sentiment with success. In his 30-room mansion perched above the Connecticut hills, everything had its place. The Persian rugs knew their corners. The crystal knew its cabinet. The staff knew their floor. And Gerald knew his. 12 years. That was how long Gerald Washington had moved through Marcus's home like a quiet current, invisible when invisibility was required, present when presence was demanded, and always, without exception, professional beyond what the job description had ever asked of him. He pressed Marcus's shirts to a crease that could cut glass. He remembered that Marcus took his coffee at exactly 180 degrees, not 1 degree warmer, not 1 degree cooler. He handled visiting dignitaries, difficult contractors, and Marcus's notoriously impatient sister with equal grace and zero complaint. In 12 years, Gerald had never once crossed a line. Until the Tuesday evening in November when everything changed, not with a dramatic confrontation, not with raised voices or broken china, but with something far more ordinary and far more human. Gerald sat down in the dining room. That was all. He simply sat down. It had been a brutal 48 hours. A winter storm had grounded the entire household staff at their homes across the county, and Gerald alone had managed the arrival of Marcus's business guests, prepared and served a 4-course dinner for 11 people, handled 3 separate calls from Marcus's assistant, fixed a burst pipe in the east corridor at 2 in the morning, and then, because Marcus had requested it for 6:30 the following evening, spent the better part of the afternoon polishing every piece of silver in the house by hand. By 8 o'clock that evening, Marcus's guests had gone. The kitchen was clean. The house was still. Gerald carried his own plate, simple food, leftover roast, and bread he'd set aside from the kitchen earlier, and walked toward the basement dining area where staff were expected to eat. But halfway down the hall, his knee gave out. An old injury, a construction accident from his 20s, flared without warning and sent a white bolt of pain straight up his leg. He steadied himself against the wall, breathed, and made a quiet decision. Just this once, he would sit at the nearest table. He chose the far end of the main dining room, the seat closest to the hallway, furthest from the grand centerpiece, furthest from anything that could be mistaken for presumption. He set his plate down gently. He Saturday. He exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 days. He had eaten approximately 4 bites when Marcus walked in. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, the kind that has temperature. Marcus stood in the doorway in his evening robe, a glass of brandy in one hand, and looked at Gerald the way a man looks at a crack in a wall he's certain wasn't there yesterday. "What," Marcus said slowly, "are you doing?" Gerald looked up. He didn't flinch. "Eating dinner, sir." My knee gave out in the hallway. "I apologize for the location." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, not toward understanding, but away from it. He set his brandy glass on the sideboard with a careful, deliberate click. "You have a dining area." "I do, sir." "Then I suggest you use it." Gerald held the gaze for one measured moment, the kind of moment that contains an entire conversation inside it, and then he did something that Marcus would spend the rest of that night trying to explain away. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize again. He simply picked up his plate, lowered himself carefully from a chair, and sat down on the marble floor right where he stood. Cross-legged. Plate in his lap. Back straight. He continued eating. Marcus stared at him. The marble was cold and pale and immaculate, and Gerald sat on it with more dignity than most men carry into boardrooms, and something about that image, something about the absolute stillness of it, sent an unfamiliar feeling crawling up the back of Marcus's neck. He told himself it was irritation. He picked up his brandy and left the room. But he didn't sleep well that night. He lay in his $4,000 bed and stared at the ceiling and kept seeing Gerald's face, not angry, not humiliated, not performing some quiet protest. Just steady. Unbothered in a way that bothered Marcus deeply. There was something in that man's eyes that Marcus couldn't categorize, and Marcus Reed categorized everything. By morning, he'd convinced himself it was insubordination. That was a category he understood. He made a mental note to address it formally. He never got the chance to feel righteous about it. Because when Marcus came downstairs at 7:15, his coffee was already waiting at exactly 180 degrees. The morning papers were folded on the left side of the breakfast tray. The fresh flowers in the entry had been changed. And Gerald was standing near the kitchen doorway, upright, immaculate, with a faint shadow of a sleepless night around his eyes that he was clearly not going to mention, holding a small envelope. "This arrived by courier last night after you retired, sir," Gerald said, extending it. "From Mr. Hargrove's office." He marked it urgent. Marcus took it without looking at it. He set it on the corner of his desk in the study, between two stacks of quarterly reports, and forgot about it for most of the morning. He had calls. He had a video conference with his Tokyo partners. He had lunch with the senator's chief of staff at noon, and Gerald drove him there and waited outside in the car for 90 minutes without complaint. And when Marcus climbed back in and said nothing about the wait, Gerald said nothing about it either. They drove home in silence. It was a particular kind of silence that Marcus had grown comfortable inside, the silence of a man who has long ago stopped considering whether the people around him are comfortable too. He looked out the window at the grey November road and thought about the Tokyo deal and thought about the quarterly projections and thought, briefly and without much feeling, that Gerald had seemed quieter than usual today. He didn't pursue the thought. Back at the house, he returned to his study and worked through the afternoon. The envelope from Hargrove sat unopened on the corner of his desk. Gerald brought tea at 3. Marcus didn't look up from his papers. Gerald left without a word. At 5 o'clock, Marcus reached across his desk for a pen and his hand brushed the envelope. He picked it up. He looked at it properly for the first time. Richard Hargrove was his estate attorney, a man Marcus only heard from at significant moments, not for routine correspondence. He turned the envelope over, and then he noticed something that stopped him completely. On the top line, above his own address, in Hargrove's precise formal handwriting, not a note, not a secondary line, but the primary name on the correspondence, were 2 words: Gerald Washington. Marcus sat very still. He read the name again. Then he looked at the rest of the envelope. It had been addressed to his home, yes, but the intended recipient, listed clearly at the top, was his butler. Not him. Gerald. The envelope had been couriered to this address because this was where Gerald Washington could be found, and someone at Hargrove's office had clearly assumed, correctly, that Gerald lived on the premises. Marcus set the envelope down on the desk. He looked out the window at the last pale light failing over the Connecticut hills. His mind moved the way it always moved when confronted with information it hadn't requested. Quickly, quietly, beginning to calculate. Hargrove was not just any attorney. Hargrove was the man who had handled every legal matter connected to Richard Cole. And Richard Cole was the man who had made Marcus Reed. 20 years ago, when Marcus was 32 years old and building something from almost nothing, Richard Cole had appeared in his life like a door opening in a wall where there had been no door. A quiet, brilliant man in his 60s, with no interest in credit and no need for recognition. He had provided the capital, the connections, and the foundational legal structure that had turned Marcus's idea into an empire. He had asked for nothing public in return. Only a private agreement, handled entirely by Hargrove. Richard had died 3 months ago, quietly, in a hospice in Vermont. Marcus had sent flowers. He had not read the obituary carefully. He had not asked questions. He had not opened the file that Hargrove's office had been trying to get to him for 11 weeks, because Marcus Reed was very good at not opening things he wasn't ready for. He picked up the envelope again. His name was nowhere on it. His hands, for the first time in a very long time, were not entirely steady. Down the hall, he could hear the soft, unhurried sounds of Gerald preparing dinner. The quiet clink of a pan. The low run of water. The absolute, unshakable composure of a man who had sat on a marble floor the night before and eaten his meal with the dignity of someone who already knew exactly how the story ended. Marcus stared at the envelope. And somewhere deep in the architecture of his certainty, in the very walls of the world he had built, something cracked. Marcus didn't open the envelope that night. That was the thing nobody would have predicted about Marcus Reed, the man who had built an empire on the principle of immediate, decisive action, who had never once walked away from a number he didn't understand or a contract he hadn't read 3 times. That man sat in his study with a courier envelope on his desk and chose, for the first time in his adult life, not to know. He told himself he was tired. He told himself it could wait until morning, that Hargrove's office observed normal business hours and whatever was inside that envelope had presumably been sitting in a file for 11 weeks already and could therefore survive 1 more night undisturbed. He was a reasonable man. He was a measured man. He poured a second brandy, moved the envelope to the left side of the desk where he wouldn't have to look at it directly, and opened his laptop. He stared at the screen for 40 minutes without reading a single word. At 10:15, he heard Gerald's footsteps in the hallway, that unhurried, precise rhythm he had listened to for 12 years without ever really hearing it. The footsteps paused briefly outside the study door, the way they always did when the light was still on late, a silent check that needed no words and asked no questions. Then they continued toward the staff quarters at the back of the house. Marcus listened until the sound disappeared completely. Then he picked up the envelope. The paper was thick. Hargrove used the kind of stationery that communicated seriousness before a single word was read. Marcus opened it with the silver letter opener that Gerald polished every Thursday morning and removed 3 folded pages of dense legal text, a smaller sealed envelope marked personal and confidential, and a handwritten note on Hargrove's personal letterhead that was only 4 lines long. He read the 4 lines. Then he read them again. Then he set the pages down on the desk very carefully, the way a person sets something down when they're not entirely sure their hands are working properly, and he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and said nothing and did nothing for a very long time. Richard Cole had a son. Not a rumored son, not an estranged distant relative, not a complicated situation that required legal interpretation. A biological son, acknowledged formally in Richard's private records 16 years ago and legally documented through Hargrove's office with the full weight of every instrument available. A son Richard had never spoken about publicly, had never introduced to his professional world, had never allowed the newspapers or the financial circles or the dinner party circuit to know anything about. A son who, for the last 12 years, had been living inside Marcus Reed's house, had been pressing his shirts, had been calibrating his coffee to 180 degrees, had been sitting on his marble floor because his employer had decided that was the appropriate place for the help to eat. Marcus pressed his fingers against his mouth and stared at the far wall where a painting hung that Richard Cole had given him as a gift when the company first turned profitable. He had always assumed it was a gesture of celebration. He read the legal pages again, slowly this time, and understood for the first time that everything Richard had ever given him had been something more than a gesture. The 49% stake was real. It was documented with the kind of legal precision that meant no ambiguity, no contest, no room for a different interpretation. When Richard Cole died, the shares he had quietly, privately held in Marcus's company, the founding shares, the ones that had existed before Marcus had anything to offer in return, had passed to his son. Not to a foundation. Not to a charity. Not to any of the institutions that Richard had publicly supported throughout his life. To Gerald Washington. Marcus reached for his phone to call Hargrove. It was past 11. He put the phone down. He reached for his brandy. The glass was empty. He looked at the painting again and thought about every conversation he'd ever had with Richard Cole and began, slowly and with growing discomfort, to reread them all from the beginning with this new information sitting over every word like a different light. Richard had asked about the staff once. Only once, in the 12 years they had known each other, had Richard mentioned the household at all, a brief, almost casual question during a lunch in the city, 3 years after Gerald had come to work for Marcus. He'd asked how Gerald was getting on. Marcus had said fine, excellent actually, reliable fellow. Richard had nodded and changed the subject and Marcus had thought nothing of it. He thought about it now. He thought about it until midnight, until 1, until the house was completely silent and the November wind was moving against the windows and the legal pages were spread across his desk in the lamplight like an indictment he hadn't known was coming. He woke at 6 with his cheek against the desk. The pages were still there. The smaller sealed envelope marked personal and confidential remained unopened. That one was not for him, he understood that now. Gerald's name was on it. He had no right to it, and the recognition of that fact arrived with a clarity that felt new and uncomfortable and strangely important. He showered. He dressed. He came downstairs. Gerald was already there. Coffee at exactly 180 degrees. Papers folded on the left. Fresh flowers in the entry, pale winter blooms that he must have arranged before 6 o'clock because that was simply how Gerald operated. Thoroughly, quietly, entirely without requirement of acknowledgement. He was standing near the kitchen doorway when Marcus walked in, and he looked the way he always looked, composed, ready, carrying nothing on his face that the day hadn't asked him to carry. Marcus stood in the doorway of the dining room for a long moment. He looked at the marble floor. He looked at Gerald. "Sit down," Marcus said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Gerald tilted his head slightly. "Sir." "At the table." Marcus pulled out the chair at the near end, not the head, not a gesture of theatre, just the nearest chair, and set it away from the table in a clear and simple invitation. "Please." Gerald looked at the chair. He looked at Marcus. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite satisfaction. Something older and more patient than either of those things. He crossed the room and sat down. Marcus sat across from him. He slid the 3 legal pages across the table without preamble, without explanation, without any of the careful framing he might have used in a boardroom to control how information landed. He just gave them over. Gerald looked at them. He read the first page slowly, the second at the same pace, the third without any change in his breathing or his posture or the angle of his shoulders. Then he folded them back along their original creases and set them on the table between the 2 men. "You knew," Marcus said. "I knew," Gerald said. The words were simple. They carried no triumph, no bitterness, no performance. They were just true, delivered in the tone of a man who has been carrying a truth for a long time and is simply setting it down now because the moment has finally arrived to do so. "How long?" Marcus asked. "Richard told me 7 years ago. He wanted me to understand the full picture. He also told me it wasn't time yet, that he needed me to stay, and to observe, and to know for myself what kind of man you were in the private hours, in the rooms where no one important was watching." Gerald paused. His words, not mine. Marcus absorbed that. Every morning for 7 years. Every shirt. Every degree of every coffee. Every quiet pause outside the study door at night to check that the light was still on. Gerald had known all of it and had shown up anyway, had done the work anyway, had performed the job with a completeness and an integrity that now, in this light, struck Marcus as something that went so far beyond employment that he didn't have a category for it. "The envelope," Marcus said. "The one marked personal. It's yours. I didn't open it." Something shifted in Gerald's face, subtle, but real. "Thank you." "I want to ask you something," Marcus said. "And I want you to know that whatever you answer, the shares are yours. That's not conditional on anything. Hargrove will reach you today." Gerald waited. "Last night, in this room," Marcus stopped. He looked at the marble floor and then back at Gerald. "I need to know what was in your face. When you sat down on the floor, there was something in your expression that I don't have a word for it." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Peace," he said finally. "It was peace. Because I had watched you for 12 years looking for something worth believing in, and I had almost stopped looking, and then you showed me exactly what I needed to see, and I knew that Richard was right to make the provision he made, and I knew what I was going to do with it." "What are you going to do with it?" Gerald looked at him across the table, across the space where a plate of simple food had sat on marble the night before last, across 12 years of pressed shirts and perfect coffee and every unacknowledged hour in between. "Something better than what's been done with it so far," he said quietly. "Not as a threat. Not as a verdict. As a beginning."